Hello and welcome everyone, and a special welcome to Mary Miss and Kate Orff. My name is Bart-Jan Polman, Director of Exhibitions and Public Programs here at the school. As many of you know, central to the public programming of this year is the idea that rather than totalizing strategies, what is urgently needed right now is a sort of choreography of dispersed interventions, which we label under a rubric called coalition. So that's the sort of thread throughout the whole semester. So through that end, the public programming this year is really meant to serve as a platform, let's say, for the creation of alliances. And in the spirit of alliances, this can take on multiple forms, and I think tonight's event very much is one of these, with Mary Miss talking about her working conversation with Kate Orff. And needless to say, Mary Miss's work is pioneering in the creation of alliances. This goes all the way from her early work in the 1970s to her current work with the city as a living laboratory, or CAL. And just to illustrate this, Mary, you have said many times in interviews that your work is about finding alternatives to singular structures, which of course resonates closely with an idea of dispersed interventions. And so is the idea that we can create our own circumstances, which can then channel into a collective vision to imagine a future, as you said. And I think this is something we desperately need right now, a collective vision to imagine a possible future. So for your WaterMarks project in Milwaukee, for example, you explain how in order to keep the network that supports it active, it is essential that the citywide coalition of city agencies, academic institutions, community organizations, and artists become integrated in the project. So that's a coalition between disciplines, if you will, but there are also coalitions within disciplines, such as the multiple artists involved in the Tibbetts Brook project, which aims to daylight the Tibbetts Brook stream. In other words, to bring it to the surface. And I don't know if you know, but we're sitting right under these panels. There's a stream running as well that maybe at one point we can also bring to the surface. So all that to say, I'm incredibly happy to have this urgent conversation here, and just a few words about how the evening will unfold. We'll first hear from Mary, who will speak about her early and about her current work, after which there will be a conversation between Mary and Kate Orff. And then, at the very specific request of Mary, we asked two students to also come up with questions. So you see Angus and Samantha here. And then, of course, we'll also open it up to all of you, the audience. So just brief bios. Everything can be found in depth online. But of course, Mary Miss has reshaped the boundaries between sculpture, architecture, and landscape design and installation, articulating a vision of engagement for the public sphere. In 2009, she founded the City as Living Laboratory, creating a framework for making issues of sustainability and climate change tangible through the arts. Miss is currently working on two urban-scale projects, WaterMarks, an atlas of water for the city of Milwaukee, and rescuing, I mentioned it already, rescuing Tibbetts Brook one stitch at a time, a project to help bring a buried stream to the surface in the Bronx. Her work has been shown at multiple places, including the Guggenheim Museum, the Sculpture Center, and the Des Moines Art Center, and she has been recognized with numerous awards, including a fellowship from the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, the Urban Lens Institute's Global Award for Excellence, and the Bedrock of New York City Award. Kate Orff, of course, is a landscape architect and the founder of SCAPE, whose activist and visionary work on design for climate dynamics has been shared and developed in collaboration with arts institutions, governments, and scholars worldwide. She's a professor here, as you all know, at Columbia GSAPP, with a joint appointment at GSAPP and the Climate School, and is, of course, the director of GSAPP's Urban Design program, where she coordinates complex interdisciplinary studios centered on urban systems of the future. And she was awarded the 2017 MacArthur Fellowship. And then Samantha Elizabeth Nowak and Angus Young, both students in the UD program here at the school, first year students, who will join afterwards. So with that, please, Mary.
Bart, and thank you, Kate, for joining this evening. When Bart asked me, or I guess somebody else asked me to come and speak, but maybe it was you, I can't remember. I was really thinking, we know what's been happening at Columbia, it's hard to avoid, but it really brings to mind the times when I just started out as a young artist in the late 60s and early 70s. And that was a very complex time. The Vietnam War was going on. Kent State happened where people were killed. It was a time when many of us really felt we had to find a different path forward. And I want to say that today because I'm hoping you are the ones who are going to be finding new paths forward right now. Joan Jonas is a wonderful artist and has done videos and kind of changed that kind of idea of what videos could be. Trisha Brown was walking up walls. George Trackus, a dear friend of mine, was going out and building things himself, still is going out and building things himself in ways that gave you a real intimate relationship to landscape and land. So there were so many people, but there were especially a lot of young women around that time who we became colleagues and allies of each other. And, we just had to invent a new path forward. And for me, that was really about trying to figure out how to work as an artist, how to come up with a vocabulary. I started making some kind of strange objects made of string and wire, but right away, early on, this project that you're seeing is from, I think, maybe 68 or something like that. It was on Ward's Island in the East River. And it's just such a simple thing. There was let's see if I can, whoa, too far, too fast. Okay, I'll get used to this, maybe. So I tied a rope to a rock, weighted it, put it in the water, pulled it taut, and staked it, and did that every 20 feet along the southern edge of Ward's Island. It was about a half mile. This was a really important early work for me. It was about, looking at the connection between the land and the water, making it necessary to walk the full length to see this work. I was surrounded by the minimalists at that time, people like Richard Serra and Robert Morris and Donald Judd. And I was trying to find some way forward that wasn't about making monoliths or, giant vertical structures, the things that weighed, thousands of pounds. And so this was, this early kind of investigation. Also, water has stayed with me the whole time since then. Now I've managed to turn it off, so somebody has to help me. I may have to pass this on to somebody else. I'm only slightly spastic, but I definitely am that. Anyway, another project was done at Oberlin College in the early 70s, and it was a 7-foot square with 3 layers of wooden lattice in it. And again, it's something that it had a very powerful kind of relation that you had to it walking up, and it was a little bit like a trap or not. And did the lattice continue all the way under the ground that you had just walked across? Those were some of the things I was thinking about. But especially that you really didn't see it until you got to the edge, but there was this kind of psychological engagement. So means of engagement, that was, I'd say, that's the phrase that has gone through this work from the beginning. How can you get people to relate to something besides looking at it as a sign? So this continued with this early work that was done down in what's now Battery Park City, a work that materialized only when you stood in front of it. That area behind is an area called the South Cove, where I returned many years later to do a project. But I really liked that it was just these flimsy pieces of wood, and it was only when you were standing in front of it that it materialized. So I'm building all of these things myself, maybe with a helper. They got more complex as time went on. This was an underground structure built in the late 70s, called perimeters, pavilions, and decoys. And it allowed you to walk under the skin of the earth, so to speak, as you went through that passageway, there was another wall with windows, those slot-like windows, and you really couldn't see how far the land was carved out. It was so dark as you peered into the windows. So there was that real question of boundaries of the perimeter of the work. And in the lower field, there were 3 tower-like structures. This was the largest one, and the smallest was so small that if you were a little heavy, it would be hard to get between the legs of it. Again, you had to walk around to see this, and I've really talked often about walking and movement and how important that was to me. I wasn't thinking in terms of architecture or trying to invade territories of landscape or architecture or planning or design, but Susanna Torre included me in the early 70s in the exhibition she did of women in architecture, and I was kind of surprised. I was just trying to find a way to make things that weren't just looked at. How could that engagement happen? How could there be an emotional connection made connecting you to the place these things were found? There was a really important piece, though, that was kind of the fulcrum point for my work, and it was done in Des Moines, Iowa, at the Des Moines Art Center. Some of you might have read about it this past year. It was commissioned by the Des Moines Art Center in, I think, '89. It was finally finished in '96, and it was destroyed last year by the museum. But what was really interesting to me with this work is I was trying to figure out how I could do a demonstration wetland in the middle of a city. You know, Iowa's been drained, tiled for farming, so that I think maybe by this time probably 85 or 90% of their wetlands are gone. So, you know, most urban dwellers were only familiar with wetlands if you were driving along looking at them from a car window. But in this kind of lengthy period of time between the commission and actually doing the project, I had time to work with many different people on developing the work, particularly a botanist at Iowa State University, who was kind of introducing me to wetlands and how they functioned and what lived there. And then I was in a meeting with Native Americans and talking about the land and the community members who had been living here using this as a skating pond for years. And as I collected that content, by the end of the project, I was very happy with what it looked like, what it was like to walk around it, that you could, you know, enter this trough and get down at eye level with the water. At another place, you could climb up and look out and see what kind of wildlife was living there. There was a very narrow path that went through some reeds. But I was really wishing that the layers of content that I had been able to have access to could be revealed to others in some way, but the project was over. As you know, important as this project was to me and completed in '96, it was the last large-scale project I was able to do. There are a lot of frustrations about being an artist, the kind of limitations that you have because of how people see art and what its role should be in our culture. And so I really was taking this kind of experience, this kind of content from this project. And as I got into the 2000s, I was not able to build anything. I really felt absolutely, you know, at the turn of the century, these kind of abstract ways I had investigated early on in my career, trying to get you to pay attention to the relationship between the built and the natural environment. That was fine, but we were facing such crises. was a different world. And so that, was really compelling me to find a different way to operate. And I guess that's one of the most important things that I think about in my years of working, is every time there was a blockade, finding a different way to operate, doing it myself, just taking it on and figuring out a way forward. So there was a wonderful gathering that the Earth Institute at Columbia sponsored, maybe in 2009 or something like that, at the Lamont Doherty Observatory of Artists and Scientists meeting. And I was in the process of kind of developing this idea of city as living laboratory. I had done a project or participated in a project in Orange County, California that didn't happen, which was about looking at how a park might function these days as not only a place of respite, but as a place where you could see new ideas about relating to the natural world. And since it didn't happen, I kind of pulled these ideas forward. I was also, I shouldn't be saying this here, finding it difficult sometimes to work with architects and landscape architects. So I was at this gathering. I met a number of scientists, and one of the most important was Eric Sanderson, who then really helped me kind of build the framework for City as Living Laboratory. What should be the basics that we were trying to communicate to people. So it was my idea that people had to understand that artists could enter the world and have an essential role. And when I talk about artists, I really mean it in the broadest sense of the word, whether it's musicians or performers or architects or visual thinkers of other kinds. We could take on the issues around the sustainability goals of the UN, for instance. We could have a role alongside the planners, the educators, the scientists. And I thought that role could be an essential one because there was a way that we could communicate that was different than the way the educator or planner or somebody else might do it. And there was an early project as I was beginning to think about this City as Living Lab that I did in Boulder, Colorado. A really wonderful person named Lucy Lepard organized a show called Weather Report, Art and Climate Change. I'd grown up part of my youth in Colorado and knew that flash flooding was a huge deal, and it turned out that Boulder's one of the highest hazard flood zones in the U.S. So I worked with people, scientists in Boulder, to plot that flood level. They could see it on a map, but what I did was go around and put about 125 of these 6-inch diameter discs on trees and buildings and bridges. And sometimes they were, sometimes they were, just slightly over your head. Sometimes they were ankle high, and sometimes they were 18 feet in the air. But there was this, it's called Connect the Dots, mapping the high water of Boulder Creek. But there was this constant line that, that you could see looking from one mark to the next. And I think what was most important about it is that you could look at those dots in relation to your own body, so that there was a visceral way for this to make sense to you, that it wasn't an abstraction. It wasn't somebody just, talking at you about what was happening. I think I became really interested in how I could continue with this. So you have to kind of be thinking that with all of these things that I'm showing, they're kind of self-initiated projects. everyone was asking me, and I'm always wearing, these are, I call it my Broadway bling. At a certain point, I had this idea that we'd look at the corridor of Broadway from the tip of Manhattan to the top of the Bronx. And we started doing walks with artists and scientists and community members. And up to now, we've probably done about 100 of these. And I had this idea that we could paint the roofs white. Well, easier said than done. At least some people think this really happened, having seen these images that have been reworked. Well, it's a hard thing to happen, but it kind of gets the point across, the skunk stripe, talking about a new way of seeing New York City. But on the ground, I thought, okay, what could we do to point out different things about the air, the water, the land, trash? And I came up with this idea of these convex mirrors with a disc in front. You stop to check yourself out, see if your lipstick's okay, and then you're kind of introduced to that topic that the mirror is focusing on. We were only able to do one installation of these mirrors at 136th Street. The idea had been to do them at intervals, at 20 intervals along the corridor of Broadway. So sometimes they're just ideas, but those ideas can often take us further as we think about them. One of the places, I said each of these sites that we went to, we did these walks with artists and scientists. And in places where there were some really more compelling issues, we ended up working longer. We've been working in Chinatown for a number of years. But one place that we've ended up doing most of our work is up in the Bronx. And when we did our first walks, we then did a workshop. Community members came, and we heard about the problem with a stream that was buried that was causing flooding. And this is, I think, around 1906, Tibbetts Brook, coming from Yonkers into Van Cortlandt Park, was put into a sewer that runs under Broadway. Every time I walk that stretch of Broadway, you're saying we've got a stream down here, but it's so strange to think that you've got Tibbetts Brook right below your feet. But the problem is, because of what happens with the combined sewer overflows, this is one of the worst overflows into the Harlem River, causing, a lot of pollution, but also it causes a tremendous amount of flooding. So there was an idea put forward decades ago of putting the stream into the old rail corridor that goes along next to the Major Digan Expressway. So again, this wasn't anybody asking us to do anything. It was really trying to think about this issue. And to me, this, I kept thinking of it, how can we rescue Tibbetts Brook? But again, we're a small studio. There were maybe 3 or 4 of us working at the time. And I thought, okay, how can we do incremental steps, one stitch at a time, either very small scale things or things that are of a larger scale. So in the image on whatever that image, you can see the red lines, and those are all of the bridges that cross the corridor of both the highway and the old rail line. And I thought, okay, if we could take those bridges over and make each of the bridges, you all might not know about these signs that they have in the West. They were called Burma Shave signs, advertising Burma Shave, aftershave lotion or shaving cream. And they'd be staggered, buy Burma Shave. And I thought, let's do it on the bridges, rescuing Tibbetts Brook, one stitch at a time. And then as you're coming south on the highway, you could see fish, insects, birds, plants, and that each bridge could be devoted to letting people have a more intimate knowledge of that stream. There was a wonderful young ecologist that we were working with from Van Cortlandt Park, and he said, you know, I look at National Geographic and they're telling me about a river in Africa. Why can't we do a stream in the Bronx and have people get to know it and be as interested in it? And I thought that was such a wonderful thing. That, you know, that what we're really thinking is if people can have a more intimate relationship with the natural world, that maybe there's a different way that it would be considered as we move forward. So we've never had a lot of support to work on this, but we could think about it. And of course, when there's a bad storm and the flooding happens right here at Van Cortlandt Park, you know, people get upset about that. And you can see some of the ideas of the bridges. And this is what the corridor that the stream is going to go into looks like. And I did this rendering to just give people, it wasn't a real thing saying this is what's going to happen, but it really helped people in the community begin to imagine, oh, it could be something, that empty corridor. So we also got artists working on this, and Bob Brain did a number of events where he would do these temporary tattoos on, and the kids were lined up down the block, and I swear there would be no other way to get these kids interested in hearing about Tibbetts Brook than getting a tattoo. But he would, as he would delicately paint this tattoo on, he would be talking about the stream and why this change was important. Another artist we worked with, Matt Jensen, collaborated with Ana de la Cueva to do this quilt where it was kind of getting 100, not kind of, they got over 100 different people in the neighborhood to embroider about 12-inch squares to make this 15-foot-long quilt, to look at what it would be like if you greened all the roofs and at the streets as much as you could around that area to help clean the water before it even gets to Tibbetts Brook. And this is not something that's going to happen anytime soon, but it gets people to begin to imagine what could happen. And the really nice thing about that, you know, all of these efforts, we were working with the Bronx Council on Environmental Quality, the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance, community groups, but the city has decided to daylight Tibbetts Brook, and it's the largest green infrastructure project the city has ever done. So I think this idea of initiating, of not waiting for somebody to ask you, but to just start looking at the world around you and figuring out a way to take on the issues. They can't always be giant issues. They could be very small things on your block and you know, in your community. There was another project that I've been working on for a number of years now, for 10 years actually, in Milwaukee. And I had done a plan for a river walk there, but it was one of these things that I was invited to do, and then the money finally wasn't there. It's a hard life for an artist, is one of my taglines, but I guess it is for anybody who wants to work in the public realm. Anyway, I went back to do a talk in 2014, and some people who had met me in my around 2000 when I was doing the proposal for the Riverwalk asked me if I would come to help tell Milwaukee's water story. It's a city built on water. That's why it's there. That's why it was a very important Native American gathering place. And there was one problem, is that there was no money attached to this, but this idea of trying to do a project about water at the scale of the city was very compelling to me. You know, I was hearing from scientists about the importance of working at scale rather than on individual projects. So I took this on as a kind of a challenge and started to try and imagine what could be done at the scale of the city that would not cost millions and millions and millions of dollars. And there were so many church steeples and stacks in the city, and this top image is of the Jones Island water treatment plant. The thing that was amazing is that there was an engineer at the Milwaukee Municipal Sewer District who was a very interesting guy. And he kind of invited me. He was part of the group that I originally met with. And he was willing to take what I was thinking about seriously. And I said, okay, could we use your stack as kind of an icon for the project? And he said, well, let me think about it. But I said, okay, I'm going to think of the city like I'm going to create an atlas. Like you might see an atlas and a map in an atlas with points called out along the side. I want to put markers up in this city. So in this very lengthy process of building connections within the city, of meeting people at this level of city agencies, and then meeting people at NGOs in the city, and then meeting people in community groups. We kind of, over this 10-year period, worked our way down to ground level. But one of the things that I was kind of a central icon was this idea of lighting the stack and its vapor blue from night to night, and that it would turn red if there was a chance of a sewage overflow. You don't want to know or may know the number of sewage overflows in New York City a year. It's a huge number. Milwaukee used to have a lot of them. They now have two and a half on average a year, although the recent rainstorm and flooding there caused a lot, a very serious overflow. But I wanted to think of this kind of as the mothership for the project, and then working with the neighborhood. And that's such an easy thing to say, and I know Kate has worked with community groups, but we were lucky enough 3.5 years ago to get a National Science Foundation grant, which allowed us to have people on the ground going into those neighborhoods and engaging on a really very deep level with those communities. And so it ended up not being us going in and saying, oh, we've got this great project for you. It was going in and listening, building relationships with those people, finding out what their interests were, and getting a sense of their knowledge of the place. And, we, can come in with our ideas, but they certainly have a huge, bank of experience and thoughts and ideas to build from. Always we were doing this with arts. I'm not showing the arts projects with this project, but just kind of giving you a sense. But every time we did one of the markers that we're going to put in the communities, there was an artist involved. But this, I show this image, and I'm kind of, I can't quite believe what happened. I was working with this really interesting man, an urban ecologist named Adrian Cerezo. And we talked about how we had to build this. We had to build relationships between agencies and institutions, as well as the communities themselves. And that's the thing that has been happening after this 3-year period of having the grant support. It also allowed us to begin to put these markers, which are kind of offspring of that mothership that I talked about. These markers are Wi-Fi hotspots for neighborhoods that really appreciate having that within the neighborhood. And these are letters that are selected by the people in that community. There's a QR code on the pole that you can hear from people in the community to understand why they've selected that particular letter. But they're really a stake in the ground for an ongoing kind of communication or conversation to be going on about the issue. You can't just introduce something and walk away. You really have to be able to keep it going. So if there is the chance of an overflow, these markers flash at night and in the daytime as well. It's easier to see it at night, but it has a collar under the letter that flashes in the daytime. So they're in these underserved neighborhoods, and I talked about kind of being amazed that what we were setting out to do happened. Our NSF grant was canceled last April 25th, and we had planned an event 2 weeks later, and the communities had done a tremendous amount of work. We were having a bus tour to these sites. By the way, at the end of this period, we'll have 13 markers. There are 2 more going in early November. And all of a sudden, we had to call them up and say, sorry, they've taken the money. We don't have anything. And everybody in of all the neighborhoods said, no, we're not stopping. We're going ahead. We had a meeting of our transition team, how we were going to have this project become a project not for the city, but of the city. And one of the community members said, you have to realize we're the keepers of the markers. You all put them there, but we're the ones that are going to be defining them as we move forward. So we now have a transition committee with the university, who is our partner with the grant, with the city, with the Discovery World, with the Natural History Museum, with an NGO that's been very involved, but particularly with this community group that we had been working with and meeting with regularly as representatives. And it's moving forward. Do we have enough money? No, to do everything, but have we got the basics covered? Yes. So there are things that have happened that are great, like getting these markers up, and the municipal sewer district is committed to doing 2 a year for the next 5 years to see how it works out in different neighborhoods where they're working. The stack was going to be lit with all the federal cuts. That got eliminated, but I never say never. We hope that more things will happen in the future. But maybe that's kind of a long-winded way of getting to, I'd really like a chance to talk with Kate about these things that we've been looking at, and also some
Yes.
of you.
Oh,
Well, first of all, thank you.
Yeah.
Mary. Thanks. So I think we can now have the conversation. Just as a transition, I was just curious,
Sure.
Kate, when did you first encounter Mary's work? Do you
Well,
remember?
that's first, Mary. Thank you. I mean, I feel like when you gently kind of launched this word seeking to the students, I sort of felt that as a student myself. I put this slide up. Oh, it's not showing here, but behind you have your Oberlin project, which I did not know you were going to show. The Untitled Project at Oberlin, Ohio, where my daughter is a college student now. And then also on the right-hand side is the Rosalind Krauss Sculpture in the Expanded Field diagram. So I wanted to just say, like, Mary's generosity in kind of talking about seeking, I think, is just such a clue for students. And so I kind of wanted to start there, because as a student, that's how I first encountered Mary's work. And if you know my own work process, I use words, I use images, and I pin them up on my board. And even if it's like, don't forget to call X, it's there. And so these images were on my board when I was in a graduate program for, at the time, landscape architecture. So I just wanted to say, Mary, I sort of felt like you were, it was like the power of the image, of the untitled image, and this kind of sense that you were sort of sending a cipher. You were sending like an Easter egg or something for us to try to unpack and understand was a very powerful was very powerful. So I know you've influenced many in landscape architecture and artists and architects and now through whole urban movements. But I wanted to just let you know that as a 23-year-old student, I was staring and trying to decipher your work, and I feel like there's so much to learn from it. I mean, I guess I wanted to kind of just open up that discussion around first this word seeking, because I feel like we learn so much from today, but I feel like part of what we can learn is the arc of your own journey. It's not necessarily a project by project kind of lineage. What you described was your own transformation in how you work. And I find that to be just incredibly fascinating, looking back to these kind of moments of being jolted and trying to understand the earth, the human body, what you're saying related to sort of psychology, and then how you began to kind of move from places to networks and then connect them all back up, particularly with Cities Living Lab. So I wanted to start with going back to that moment when you began to switch. You mentioned in a funny way about the early 2000s when you were at the conference in Lamont, and that's another interesting moment for Columbia, at least, that I'm very excited to learn about that in your history, that you were working with Joan Jonas and George Tracus. And now I remember interacting with Cynthia Rosenzweig around that time, and the late Stuart Gaffin, so rest in peace.
Yeah.
Really important person who, would be out using heat sensing cameras. So I guess I wanted you to, go into a little bit deeper into that moment in your arc of your change where you began to shift more towards urban contexts and more with this eye on climate. Can you just talk about that moment in your work, because it is a pretty profound transformation from, building pieces with wood and string and rock, and then to kind of shifting your frame to the wider network of people. What was going on in your mind, or what sort of triggered this shift in your creative process?
I think it was this building awareness of the pressures going from the 90s to the aughts.
Mm-hmm.
It was, wait a second. I mean, when I started out with that focus on the kind of collision between the built and the natural environment, it was a very felt thing. I just was kind of taken by seeing these things around me and the way landscape and built structures were colliding and crashing into each other. But the impact that it was having and what the results were, I wasn't thinking that far ahead.
Mm-hmm.
But it was becoming, by the turn of the century, obvious that there were these really very pressing issues. And I was so frustrated at not being able to have access. So there was a sewage treatment plant that I was working on for about 3 years as a project, showing how a place of infrastructure could become a public space and get people interested in what that plant did in Arlington, Virginia. And then it didn't happen. And then the walkway in Milwaukee, trying to show the relationship between the city and the river, the Milwaukee, and that didn't happen. And another, it was just frustrating. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I can't sit here and not be doing things. I've got to find a way to operate. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I had to do was to get people to acknowledge the role that artists could have, that kind of visceral engagement, that we could connect people. We're going into these communities in Milwaukee to work. People are really in stressed situations. They do not have the time, the energy to think about things that are beyond, feeding their families, keeping themselves housed. But if you can find another route into building a
That
relationship
conversation.
about something. So it was, in a way, I think, frustration that got me to think, did I ever think I was going to be running a nonprofit, and then finding ways to support it? And, it never occurred to me. And finding ways to work in public spaces in the city, it's one thing for me to get to go and have a big open field I can build something in. But once you start trying to do all the things that a city wants, then, okay, how do you do that? So I don't know, those are some.
Yeah. No, I think that's so important because I often feel like there's this, we're somehow admired in this like problem solution framing, and you're very much in a different world in terms of showing people ways of thinking and ways of engaging that are bringing people's like creative selves to that moment. And I think that's super important. And I know the urban design students can all like learn from that shift in mindset because it's wildly important. I had a question for you also around, SCAPE has the privilege of working adjacent to Mary's work in Battery Park City now. And I remember the first moment when I learned that we were somehow going to be working on this project and trying to think about how to adapt this, piece of shoreline where South Cove is so prominent for climate change. It was like, well, we better call Mary and figure out, because that piece is so important for New Yorkers, and I know our students have traveled and seen that. But I feel like that was really a very early moment in our city's history where the water and the water's edge became a subject, and I mean that with awe for you, because that was the second part of the answer, Bart, which is I actually met Mary in person in 2009. We were doing, at that time, a project called Oyster Texture at PS1. We had a little office, with 4 people, three Columbia urban design students, and then Mary came to an open pinup, and I remember being like, "That's Mary, miss. Go get a photograph of her." So Ben, who worked on the project, ran over. So I have a photo of you from that time. And I remember really dying because you were like, "This is very interesting." I thought, Mary thinks it's interesting. Oh my gosh. So I was super excited. But your project at South Cove was just super important for the city. And I guess, because all of your ideas about like having the water feel like very visceral around people's legs and bringing people out over the water, modifying the edge, bringing people's eyes up, and that experience of people being up and looking across and then moving down. I mean, that was a moment where I think it was, super interesting to kind of translate what you were doing into a really, large, significant kind of urban project. So we're wildly, grateful for your success there, because it really kind of pointed, I think, all of us in a direction, and kind of showed what we needed to be thinking about and prioritizing. So my question to you is also about the theme of like time and change in your work, especially the Iowa project, and what happened there was just so disturbing and distressing, because I feel, in a way that it serves as a marker for time and change. But have you had any other kind of thoughts around your earlier work, say, or the idea of the temporary and how time or change plays out now, or do you see it differently?
Well, it's a complicated question, because those early works that I did, the perimeters, pavilions, the underground structure, that was up for a year. Many of my early works were up for a very short period of time. And I was just so happy to be able to see something materialize. And, you know, I was building them myself. The underground structure I built with a teenager, you know. And when there was the opportunity to have a permanent work, there had been something done at Laumeier Park in St. Louis that is still there and in pretty good shape. I was just at Governor's State University outside of Chicago, where there's the Manilow Sculpture Park, and they've just restored a work there. I thought it was very unfortunate that the work in Iowa did not stay there because of what our issues are these
Yes,
days.
exactly.
You know, it's
we
like
need it now. Actually.
we need it now.
Yeah,
You know,
I
it's like,
agree.
how do you get people to have this
Yeah.
more intimate engagement with the land and the water and the environment? And it really did that well, you know. And as it was threatened, I heard from so many people who live in Iowa and live in Des Moines. So I think that's why I felt very badly about it. And, you know, I felt that it had not been considered important, you know, enough to be able to, because it's, you know, if you have a porch on a house, you've got to keep it up, you know,
Yeah.
that's just a law of physics. It's not that everything's going to stay there forever, but I thought that was
Right.
untimely demise.
That lesson is so apt right now. So I know, and I all I would say is, you know, I know that perimeters, pavilions, decoys was temporary, but that image again, it was seared in many people's brains, including my own, and the questions that you were asking.
I know you've got the diagram
Oh
up
yeah,
there.
we didn't talk about the diagram. What is your
The
feeling
diagram,
on that?
I was always like scratching my
Like,
head.
what is that?
Now,
Yeah.
wait a second. What is she trying, you know?
Yeah.
The thing is, that there was some point that was missed, though, by the person who made the diagram, Rosalind Krauss. I really wanted to work in the expanded field, but I don't think she ever really considered that possibility. So I've ended up doing what I wanted to do and what I think is implied there. But I don't think that she knew how to deal, or
Yeah.
any of those of her folks knew how to deal with actually going out and being in the world, because once I was out in the world, it was like I was no longer an artist.
Right.
I really do consider myself an artist, not a.
I mean, I think that's also that layer of the civic imagination that's kind of missing there. It's sort of trapped and bounded, and your work is really pushed forward into a much more kind of civic and public sphere. I have one more question that I want to ask before I turn it over to the students, and maybe it's when we were researching Battery Park, we looked up a lot of old movies of you and photos of you, like pointing, you know, like positioning all the things, and I was like, okay. And then I also saw some images of you and videos of you kind of giving interviews and so on. And you know, I think it was interesting because you were also positioning yourself at that time around, you mentioned Richard Serra earlier, and like how you were trying to make and find your way as an artist and do things differently. So do you think that, would you consider yourself a relationship to feminism, or how do you position yourself there?
It was incredibly important to me, the feminist movement. And, you know, all these wonderful young women that were working in the early 70s and late 60s, and who've made such major contributions, you know, to the way we think these days. And it allowed the feeling, I guess, I feel like today everything's being made smaller and smaller and less possibilities, less expansive thinking. And having that support structure, that affirmation, it gave such a sense of agency, of being able to really go out and explore and think of new ways to do things and invent new ways to do things and cross boundaries. And it was just, it's what informed me to the extent that in 2010 I'm, forming a nonprofit and, leading this life, which is sometimes not as much as being an artist as I would like to be, but I think I felt the whole thing with City as Living Lab was this idea that we don't need one artist coming up with a solution or one designer. We need a constellation of artists and thinkers and musicians and people across cities looking at and coming up with ways of creating change. And I'm willing to put these last years into that effort of trying to get that idea across.